Hello, everyone. Everybody having a good con so far? I'd like to welcome you to the Military Science Fiction panel. We have a very august group of panelists here. Hopefully you'll get something out of this. So I'd like to start first with introductions, and we'll start here with Rick on this side.
Hi there, my name is Rick Partlow. I write military science fiction. I have about 59 books, the most popular of which is the Drop Trooper series, Contact Front.
I'm David Weber. I'm promiscuous. I write just about anything. I think I'm probably best known for the military science fiction. I think most people associate me most strongly with the Honor Harrington series.
Hi, I'm Rachel Aukes. I've written about 30 novels, most recently with some military science fiction with my Waymaker Wars series. But I guess I've also gotten around in a way of doing some multiple genres, anything from science fiction to horror to even dabbled with romance.
I'm Brad R. Torgersen. Military science fiction, hard science fiction. I was fortunate enough to be at Dragon Con in 19 with David and won the Dragon Award for my last science fiction novel, Star Wheel Sky.
And I'm Jonathan Brazee. I'm a retired Marine colonel. Got about 85, 90 books right now, mostly military science fiction. I've also been a Dragon Con nominee, but I won't tell you who beat me that year, David. But I don't hold that against him.
Larry beat you too.
Well, Larry beat me last year, so, and we got someone else who got beat. There's a lot of people who've been beat by David and Brad. Well, now let's get. No, actually, Rick's been beat too.
I got beat by Larry.
Rick got beat by Larry Carrillo. It's a good club. It's a very large club, yes it is. Okay, so let's talk about military science fiction. Baen editor Tony Weisskopf has described military science fiction as military science fiction is written by people who have a clue about how the military actually works, while militaristic science fiction was written by Gene Roddenberry. And I think that's pretty accurate. Military science fiction is the largest subgenre within science fiction. So there's a lot of readers and a lot of writers. So let's get into this a little bit. And first, what I'd like to ask is, other than what Tony just said, what really differentiates military science fiction from other militaristic science fiction and space opera? And we're going to start this with Brad.
Boy, that's a big question. I want to fall back on the idea that military science fiction, from an authentic standpoint, typically has a military veteran writing it, but not always. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it is often the case. One of my favorite series of all time that I can remember as a teenager liking was written by W. Michael Gere, and it's ostensibly militaristic, but reading it in hindsight with 20 years of military experience under my belt, I can tell where the holes are, and I don't fault him for that because I don't think he was ever in the military. It's just you kind of don't know what you don't know if you haven't had that up close and personal experience. So that's maybe one way to look at it, maybe.
Yeah, I would say simply, to me, military science fiction has military themes to it. The main themes within your story has to be tied with the military. I don't have a military background, so it definitely means I have to do a bit more work to make it feel real. I need to reach out to the people who have more experience, but without a doubt, that doesn't stop anyone from writing it.
I have no personal military service, but I come from a family and a community that has a lot of military service. And Sharon was commenting the other day that, do we have any close friends that aren't vets or cops? And I said, sure, let me think. What kind of thing? I think that for me, what separates good military fiction from militaristic fiction is that it has to deal with the cost. Any good story has to be about the characters. If it's not about the characters, nobody cares. Good military fiction has to deal with the cost to the characters you make the reader care about. And if it doesn't, then it's splatter porn. And in my imagining of the universe, that puts it firmly into the militaristic rather than the military science fiction.
I think a lot of it has to do with mindset as well. Militaristic science fiction, if you're talking like Star Trek, the goals in mind are usually broader, and the characters tend to think in terms of the whole species, or the future of mankind. In military science fiction, there's a mission, there's a objective. Their job is to do it, and if people have to die getting it done, then they do. But the objective is a military one. It's a military mindset of people who are doing their job, not captains of starships who are trying to get relations open with unknown races. That's a totally different type of thinking for the main characters.
One question I get asked a lot is, how much does history, real-life battles, how much do they make an appearance in my books? So I'd like to ask the authors here. I already know a couple answers what I'm going to get, but I'd like to have the writers here say that, and we'll start with Rachel.
All right, so I use a lot of real history in my books, even though you might not get the feel for it. So I have Sun Tzu sitting on my bookshelf, as I imagine everyone does here, because that feeds your strategy for working out, because military strategy is going to be ageless. A lot of things change through the centuries, but there is certain strategies that stay the same. And then I like to pick inspiration from real life events because it makes my scenes a lot deeper. I try not to just transplant them. I do try to just take inspiration and involve them. Like, in my last series, I used like Sherman's Atlantic campaign, where during the Civil War, Sherman had gone out and his goal was to destroy all the supply lines and destroy morale as he had gone through the South. And so I like to pull that out and say, okay, well, what if that happened in space? If you want to destroy supply lines in space, you're dealing with a lot bigger battlefield there, but and also destroy morale along the way. What would that look like? And then more ideas start coming from that. So I tend to use real life battles and things as a basis, as a starting point for me to build some fun scenes.
I use history less in the battles than in the grand strategy and the tactical doctrine. I was going to teach college history. That was what I thought I was going to do right up to when I was finishing up my master's thesis. And I think it may show in my books. But I am more inclined to take history and use parts of it to build my own platform. And so it's a mistake to look too closely at one of mine and say, this is France, this is whatever, kind of thing. But one thing you really need to bear in mind if you're using history as the basis for what you're writing, it doesn't matter whether or not it's based on something that historically actually happened. It also has to be something you can convince your reader people were stupid enough to do. Okay, if you wrote a novel around the Battle of Sedan in the Franco-Prussian War, you would have to work really hard to convince your readers that the French command was that incompetent. And the fact that you could say, well, that really happened, the readers are going to say, oh yeah, sure, pull the other one. So when you pick the history that you're going to use, bear that in mind as part of the smell test you have to have in mind when you start working it into the storyline.
Like David, I have a background in history. I majored in college and took some graduate courses. Did not get my master's. But I tend to write the wars as based on actual wars, as in the motivation. But I don't try to imitate battles. I don't try to... I don't try to imitate battles from history because I feel like I am constraining the world that I built and the technology and how that affects the military into the artificial constraints of a battle that took place with steam or sail or, in the 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So I try to make the motivations the same. I try to keep the mindset of the people planning the missions the same and planning the strategy, but I don't try to imitate directly historical battles.
David talks about cost, and probably that can't be emphasized enough. And one thing I've been recommending since it came out, I think a couple years ago, especially for people who don't have any direct military experience, is They Shall Not Grow Old. Peter Jackson's, it's not really a hagiography, it's almost a loving eulogy to the British and British Empire soldiers of World War I. I think that's a good way to look at the lives of the actual people doing the fighting. Now, the combat itself, especially if you're writing military science fiction, will change a lot because of the technology. One of the problems I ran into, and it wasn't really a problem for me, I found it very intriguing and engaging, but if you are doing space battles, like we're used to cinematic space battles, where it's very swoopy and fighter planey in Star Wars and Star Trek, and I grew up with that like so many other people, and I loved it. But when I approached this particular project for Star-Wheeled Sky, I really had to think hard about the technology because I was writing hard science fiction at the same time I was trying to do military science fiction. And I had to think about, well, what's that really going to look like when the fleets or the squadrons are not using fighters, they're using big bulky ships, they're going to see each other coming from millions of miles away, there's no real hiding, there's no stealthing, there's no, these are the things you would have to think about are also going to play into the psychology of your characters. And how is this kind of combat that might be drawn out over days or weeks or months of tedium as you cross between the planets? And again, I wasn't using warp drive, I was trying to calculate back of the envelope. It would take days or weeks to go from this point to this point in the solar system and so on and so forth. So that's just food for thought about how you can think about how your military people stuck in that pressure cooker situation. They're in combat, but it's this weird combat because it happens all at once and then it lulls, and then it happens all at once and then it lulls. And I know, having talked to other vets, that's not too different from the combat they've experienced, because it's a lot of tedium and boredom punctuated by incredible fear and adrenaline rush, and then it's back to tedium and boredom again.
Actually, as you were talking about tech, that's a nice little segue into the next question. How important is both the presence and the degree of military technology in the future military technology in your books? How much do you put the weight? And we'll start here with David.
Why would you want to start with me? Especially if you are doing naval combat in space, then the parameters of your hardware is absolutely fundamental, and you have to communicate those parameters well enough to the reader for you to understand why the characters are doing what they're doing. I was listening to Brad talking about the long delays. I was thinking, really and truly, in some respects, that's not a whole lot different from the age of sail, when you could see your opponent at 25 miles, 50 miles if you're looking at his mast tops, and your ships are capable of maybe 4 knots. So you have all this time, and then when you actually engage in the battle, you have this incredible exchange of rapid broadsides slaughtering the people on the ship and whatnot. The hardware that you develop, especially in science fiction, is usually key to the tactics, the menu available to your characters for accomplishing missions. And therefore, it is going to define the framework of the entire story. The other side of that, if you're writing military science fiction, that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but you should at least have in the back of your mind, okay, is where whatever mission you're assigning works into the grand strategy of the two sides enveloped in this war. And that's partly because you have to have a feel for how important this particular campaign, this particular battle is. Is this, they shall not pass on the road to Paris? Or is this, we're going back and forth in the desert with the Benghazi stakes in World War II? you have to have that calculated in along with the hardware, and the hardware is going to determine how critical the battle is more often than not. The main thing is that once you incorporate hardware into it, you have to think about the logical implications of that hardware. You have to think about not just the logical implications of what they can do with it, but if you have given them weapon system number A based on the technology that they have, why don't they have weapon system number B? Or do they? Okay? If you give them 3 God weapons and they're using matches to light the fuse, then you've got a problem, if you see what I'm saying. And once you have those logical implications worked out, you have to make sure that you don't violate your own internal continuity. If you're going to introduce a superior weapon, there has to be a reason why that weapon has been introduced. You have to understand how it's going to factor into the tactical mix you already have and how it's going to change. And you need to be sure that in doing so, you're not breaking the picture by changing a fundamental principle that you've established earlier in the book of the series.
I agree that internal consistency is the most important thing with technology. My focus is more on the boots on the ground, and the grunts in the mud than David's with space fleets. But I find that the technology is key to tactics and strategy. Something as simple as cover and concealment. Anybody who's been in the military knows the difference between cover and concealment. But when the enemy has a Gauss cannon that can shoot tungsten slugs at 6,000 feet per second through anything, what's cover? So maybe you don't have cover anymore. Maybe that changes the very nature of infantry combat. Maybe mobility has to take the place of cover. So things like that are something you have to think about in the world building of your militaries if you plan to get into that level of detail. I've read books where people just basically substitute, this is a while ago, but substitute, Vietnam troops, and put them on an alien planet, and think that that's military science fiction. In my opinion, it's not. And if you want to make people believe what you're reading and have some kind of sense of verisimilitude, then you need to think through the tactical implications of the technology you've chosen.
Something I just thought of while I was talking about this. Hammers, slammers, okay? Basically, that's what David did, was he transferred his Vietnam experience into the slammers, but you have to take a look at what he did with the technology at the same time that he did it. And that mandated changes, which he incorporated very well.
Yes, Hammer Slammers was very well done. He knew he wanted to write Vietnam on an alien world, but he knew he couldn't just take Vietnam combat en masse and put it there. He had to change things. He had to make things make sense, and I appreciated that.
I think I fairly covered it, but yeah, the technology is going to, if you introduce a weapon, there's going to be a counter weapon. The instant any kind of weapon is introduced into your universe, somebody's going to figure out a counter to it or be trying to figure out a counter. And then, of course, there's a counter to the counter. So I think that can be part of your, not only your action, but also your plotting. Because the instant there's a one-up on somebody, they're going to be trying to find a way to neutralize that one-up. And you can get into questions of espionage. There's an old Clint Eastwood Cold War thriller called Firefox that I am a fan of. It didn't get a lot of press back in the day, by my memory, but I've always thought this is a wonderful blend of pretty much military, like near future science fiction, at least back in the early 80s. It was near future, with spy thriller, and it was kind of about that. It's about, you've got a one-up. How do we neutralize it? How do we steal it? How do we replicate it? How do we counter it?
Yeah, so they've all said some good things. I don't have a ton to add. Consistency is crucial because readers can suspend their disbelief with a lot of made-up weapons and technologies as long as you give them kind of, making things consistent within your world building. And limits, yes. Yep. And then I had fun. So sometimes going in the future, it's not always leaping ahead in technology. So in Space Junk, what I had done, I thought, well, what if we kind of go backwards and kind of put everyone in a corner and take away everyone's weapons? How can you have a military science fiction if no one's got guns? So when the Waymaker showed up in chapter 1 and all of a sudden our military had all of their guns pulled away, how can they still continue forward and protect and things? And so they had to get creative, but it started off at older technology again, moving forward through the books of developing new and better warfare technology.
Rick just mentioned the importance of verisimilitude. Part of verisimilitude in any kind of military fiction is the language of the military. So how do you incorporate current modern day military jargon or historical jargon, or are you making up your own jargon? How do you incorporate that in your books to give it a feeling of verisimilitude?
I try not to use too much current jargon because it's changed just in like the last 20 years. So I don't want to make people think I'm just doing what I said and taking, Iraq war experience, combat and transplanting it 200 to 300 years in the future. But you have to take the spirit of it into account. You have to understand the way the military makes acronyms and make up your own that sound right, and also the way that the regular troops make fun of them and make their own versions of them.
I completely agree with everything he said. Be careful about transplanting current jargon into the future. It can work, but it can also go overboard. I know when I was much younger, I loved throwing that in there, but of course that was before I had joined the military. But my personal history is that I was wanting to be a science fiction writer since the time I was 18 years old. I didn't join the military until 10 years after that, so I quickly discovered after joining the military, there's a lot more going on here, especially in terms of acronyms, jargon, lingo, et cetera, et cetera. I would say try to strike a happy medium. Also, something else that just occurred to me is you are writing for a general audience, and don't worry about, there's always going to be a tiny percentage of veterans specifically who are going to call you out. They're going to say, you got this wrong, you got that wrong, you got this other thing wrong. That's fine. Don't worry about that. I would say really don't worry about that so much, because verisimilitude is about your reader's buy-in. As long as you can achieve reader buy-in, however you do it, that's fine. There's always going to be a tiny percentage on the side who either say you did it wrong or you should have done something different. That's cool. I get that. Absorb it as best as you can, have some humility with that, but realize that that small percentage of people is not who you're writing for. It's the bigger, broader audience that loved, aliens and the colonial marines and aliens, and that loves Star Trek, let's say that, or Star Wars, As long as you can achieve buy-in with that audience, you should be okay.
Yeah, I try to keep things simple so I write how I like to read. And if there's too much jargon, too many acronyms, I feel like it slows down my pace in reading. And even though, in the military, there is a ton of 3-letter acronym, 4 or 5-letter acronyms, acronyms across the board, and in jargon, and I really try to keep it as simple as possible. So it's not very realistic how simple I keep it, but I do it intentionally because I feel like the story won't age quite as much. Because some stories have so much jargon and stuff that feels very almost pop culture, so unless it becomes a pop culture icon, it kind of ages poorly.
There's a reason the military communicates with its members the way that it does. You have to put yourself inside that kind of mindset if you're going to create jargon of your own. You also have to be aware that you cannot overload, especially a civilian audience, with too much military speak. Too much mil speak, and they're like, huh? Okay, I mean, they lose what you're telling them because of the way you're telling it to them. There's an excellent book, Civilian's Guide to the Military, which is pretty good. It even includes some really deliberately really badly written pieces of military fiction. But the main thing is for me that the jargon that I use has very little to do with present day jargon except in things like military courtesy and that sort of thing. The jargon that I use grows out of the tech that I'm incorporating in the book, out of the tactical constraints I'm incorporating in the book. And I kind of unpack it for the reader when I begin creating it, and then the characters use it when they use it. They don't use it when it's not appropriate for them to use it. But unless you have that awareness that military people talk to military people like other military people, there's going to be a false note in what you're writing. Even if people don't realize what it is, there's going to be that little, kind of thing here. Now, I have, upon occasion, had very helpful copy editors who have done things to me, like having people salute sergeants, kind of thing. This is not a helpful thing if you have military readers, But the problem is that the copy editor wasn't military and thought that I had made a mistake and fixed it. And I didn't catch the fix because I knew you didn't do that, kind of thing. So that's another thing that you have to look out for, and not just where jargon and military protocol is concerned.
Actually missed one that I wanted to talk about, so we'll go back to that. We have one of the premier space fleet, if I could use a term that Amazon uses, writers right up here. We have writers who write more of grunts in the field. As a writer, there's a huge difference between spaceships battling out in space and infantrymen fighting over a field. As a writer, how do you make those interesting? What are the differences? What are the similarities that we do as writers to make those books work? And I think we're on Brad right now.
I think it's an often criticized movie, but I think this is one of the things that the movie Starship Troopers got right, is the rivalry. That's one thing that I wasn't really clued in on as a young man, but when I joined and was very quickly clued in on, is rivalries, friendly and not so friendly, will exist between the various services and their various functions. There'll be a lot of cynicism and put downs. Now, it's weird because, like, if an outsider comes in with the same kind of criticism, then everybody kind of closes ranks and it's like, hey, bug off, buddy. But amongst the military members, there will be a great deal of rivalry, and it will drive a kind of a sense of competition and also a sense of resentment, and this can play into your character psychology a great deal. In terms of my experience, I come from an Army background, so all of our training is very much in the mud and the wet and the rain and all that, sitting in a trash tent in Poland while the rain comes through the roof and all this fun stuff, which is completely different from somebody who's had naval experience. And so I've gotten good at talking to my friends who have been in the Navy and know what it's like to be out on a ship, and you're in very tight confined spaces, and it's all steel and pipes everywhere, which is very, very different from wandering around in a field, carrying something heavy and lethal, and it's hot and it's miserable and you're sweating to death. I mean, I think those visceral experiences, if you can either talk to people that have had those experiences, or again, things like They Shall Not Grow Old are very excellent, I think, at giving you a picture of what it was like for that specific kind of combat. And there's all kinds of historical television programs and books to read that can kind of give you that visceral feeling of what it was like to be on the submarine and you're 100 feet under the water. I mean, Das Boot, right? That's probably the most famous submarine movie, maybe of all time. Great movie. Everyone praises it for good reason, because I think it gave a very pungent, tangible, and very tragic picture of what it was like to be on these really fragile, strange little boats. The technology was not that perfected, and it was dangerous to the crew. It was, I mean, things like that, I think, really bring your story home in terms of making it matter, making the lives and the experiences of those characters matter.
Yeah, so between Space Fleet and Space Marine, the way I see it is when you're dealing with space fleets, they're epic in scale, grand, huge. You're talking things cover millions of miles, and the feel of what you're covering at that time should be huge. Where Space Marine to me is very intimate, very personal, and you can obviously include both elements within your story. Anyone who's read my books are like, well, you don't have a space fleet, and I've never seen a Space Marine. So my military science fiction is a cousin of Space Marine. I have guerrilla warfare, and all of my soldiers are freedom fighters. So it's just a different type of military. It's helped me cheat a little because I don't have my military background. So even though I still need to reach out to people and have a solid military structure in place, I can get by without having some of the rigor that, Space Marine readers can be relentless if you get something wrong. They want things really hammered out. So I kind of cheat things a little to be able to still write what I'm passionate about. But that's the way I see it. I try to fit, when it comes to the soldier side, make it as visceral as possible, make it as real and personal. There's a lot of things that happen when they have to kill someone. How are they going to react to that? How is that going to inform their next week and their life? And a lot of that comes into play. And then my space fleets, you'll see, since I have the aviation background, it tends to usually be very ship-based. Everything's all tied around my ships. I'm a general pilot, general aviation, so I do a lot of the flying the old planes, the old warbirds, tail chasing, that kind of stuff. So. Yeah, a goose, a twin beach, and some old Stearmans. So.
I think that, by the way, I would like to add the enemy below to Das Boot for if you want to understand submarines and surface warfare kind of thing. I'm going to sound like I'm going off tangent here for a minute. I do that sometimes, but hang with me. I have been asked how I write convincing female characters. And I tell people the answer is that I don't. I write convincing human beings who happen to be female. All right? I think the same thing applies to your writing your military fiction. The battlefield may change. The exact circumstances of the combat may change. You may have somebody in the Command Information Center on the carrier, and you may have somebody who is fighting his way off the beach. But they're still convincing human beings. They have to be in a convincing environment to be convincing human beings. And you have to be able to conceptualize that environment well enough to produce those convincing human beings in those situations, okay? If you do that, everything else pretty much takes care of itself. But something that, as a writer of military fiction, you must never, ever forget is that 90% or more of your audience has zero personal experience with violence. Their experience with violence is all visceral. I mean, it's all secondhand. It's all what they've seen in the movies, what they've read in the books, what they've seen in the news. You have a responsibility as a writer of military science fiction to remember that in terms of structuring your story, and also to remember that in the way in which you prevent the consequences of violence. If you don't do that, to my mind, that is an immoral act, okay? Now, some people believe nobody can possibly write it as bad as it is, so I will write it as bad as I possibly can. The problem with that is that you burn your audience's sensitivities out. It's the same way that somebody in combat has to shut down. The readers shut down on the sheer gore that you're throwing at them. So this is just one word of advice from me. Instead of trying to wade through the gore every single time you're dealing with an engagement, save it up and hit your reader with the occasional moment that drives it all home. If you've read my Saganami Island, Shadow Saganami series, the destruction of that pinnace with Ranhild Pavlitic and the people on it, where they're there, they have no idea anything is coming, then bam, They're all gone. And the way the people in the story have to deal with that is a way to bring that cost home to your reader without burning them out.
I think that the differences between fleet actions and grunts on the ground is not as important as the similarity. And the similarity has, for me, is you're dealing with this from the point of view of a character. So you're not, when you're doing fleet action or you're doing Marines on the ground, you're not like trying to describe what's happening in a clinical AAR type of way. You're describing how one person is experiencing it, or one person per scene is experiencing it. And if you're in a spaceship that's in battle, you're going to be experiencing tension for maybe hours, at least minutes, until something happens very violently that you can't control, most likely. And then you're trying to figure out what happened. If you're a grunt on the ground, you're experiencing tension for however long it takes to contact with the enemy until you have seconds of extreme violence and you shoot at something you may not understand where it is, and then you try to figure out afterwards, where were they? What happened? Who was shooting at us? Where was I shooting? And it's going to be the same whether it's in space or on the ground. You're looking at this from the experience in the interior of the brain of one character, and you're trying to make the audience, the readers, see through those eyes and understand the experience you would have in either of those situations.
I want to leave a few minutes for questions at the end, but I have one more question. So if you have, I'm going to open this up to anybody on the panel if you have something you want to say. One of the facts of life and war is death. David's already talked about splatter porn. How do you handle death? And let's try to keep it a little bit briefer so we have a chance for some questions, but anybody who has something to say on that, please.
I think the important thing in military science fiction in handling death is to make sure that you show the impact of the death on the main character. And I mean, if just look at nowadays you can watch news videos of troops in combat reacting to actual people they know dying. I mean, it's just sad and kind of voyeuristic, but it gives you a chance to see even hardened, people who've seen combat over and over. Somebody they know dies, they break down crying. Maybe right there, maybe after they get out of harm's way, but it hits them really hard. And not just because it's a friend who died, but because every friend who dies, you get closer to you dying. And that's the selfish part of it that's hiding inside. But it's also, you've lost a friend, you have to write their relatives and let them know they died. So make sure you don't have people shrug off the deaths of, maybe it wasn't a main character, so they're, it's shrugging it. No, they know these people. They're their friends. It's going to hit them harder than getting shot themselves would.
The sad truth about combat is that people die. Now, in some cases, it's almost worse that people live because of the damage that they've taken, physical or emotional or spiritual. But people die. In my books, nobody is immune from dying. And my readers know that. Now, they will probably figure that Honor Harrington's going to get a pass, okay? But anybody else could be fair game. One of the things that many of my military veteran friends have tried to express to me is the capriciousness of death. You don't get to vote and say, but he was such a great guy. He's still gone. Okay, you had breakfast with him on the carrier. You flew the mission to Haiphong. He and his guy in back didn't come back. Nobody saw him go down. You don't have a clue what happened to them. They're just gone out of your life. As a writer, you have to be able to communicate that pain, that loss, and how you cope with it, what you do so that you can keep going on and doing your job and surviving into what you're writing. And you have to make that available to readers who don't have any experience remotely like that. And it can be hard. The other thing that it can be is for you as the writer, it can be very, very costly, because you have to respect your characters. You have to own your characters. If you don't, your readers won't. And that means when a character who is beloved by your readers die, that's a character who is beloved by you. And you have to be aware that you just killed one of your best friends. And it can be hard, but you have to be willing to do it.
Okay, we have time for not too many questions. So one or two questions, if you could please go to the microphone over here to your right. Well, a few of you to your left.
Hi, my question is for everybody on the panel. I just wanted to know, for you personally, if there's a defined threshold that you have for how much military realism you put in your work. Maybe like a percentage, like 80% or 50%, 100%.
Either there's military realism in the work or there isn't. Okay? I mean, the portions of it that deal with the military, you have to have the military realism in it. The portions of it that deal with people who aren't in the military, you don't do it. Okay? But I mean, seriously, if there's anything in there that's in the military component that doesn't have military realism in it, you didn't do your job.
We talked earlier about verisimilitude. I mean, really, that's what that comes down to. Now, how you achieve that, I mean, that's going to take some homework, right? And one of the duos that I always cite that I thought did it brilliantly was one of them had been a Army infantry, had gone through Ranger School, was a long-range recon patrol in Vietnam, had seen combat, and his best friend was a hippie reporter, and together they wrote some of the best military fiction and military science fiction I've ever read, which is Chris Bunch and Alan Cole. Somehow between the two of them, they managed to do exactly that. They hit that, for me anyway, that happy medium. And I loved their books when I was a teenager without my own military experience, and it was fascinating because after I joined the military, it didn't lose a beat. It was even more true to my experience after joining than when I was just a spectator as a young man.
Hi, my name is Rich Haley, Navy vet, and I just wanted to let the Marine on the panel know a belated happy birthday to the Marine Corps.
Thank you.
And there are
Hoorah.
crayon cakes in the machine just outside.
Oh. Kiwi, we have 2 minutes left. Let's go really quickly down the line. If you have one final comment, one comment.
Okay, so again, I hit this before. You're looking for audience buy-in. That's really the bottom line. Each of you will figure it out for yourselves, and you'll know you're doing it right based on your audience feedback.
I would say if you're writing the story and you're focusing on the warfare, you're doing a disservice to your readers. You need to focus on the characters first and foremost. And military science fiction, good military science fiction, is exactly what David was talking about, and everyone here is the impact to the soldiers and the people in that war. What if a grunt on the ground is forced to kill a child suicide bomber? And then, surprise your reader when you go up and check the body and realize they didn't even have a bomb on them. What kind of instant PTSD does that give to that grunt? And how is that going to impact them for the rest of their life?
Always remember that the character that you're writing about has to have genuine responses to what happens. Do not decide this character is going to have this response and then write the scene. Learn the character, write the scene, and let the character respond. Otherwise, you're just going to lose your readership because you're not creating people, you're creating tokens on a game board.
Also remember that even though there's a lot of temptation in military science fiction to make it more like a role-playing game or some sort of miniatures game on a table. What's going to make the audience relate is the reaction, how it feels to a person. If you're in the mud, you're smelling the death and the blood, that's how people want to know how that feels to people. Not, well, this army went this way and then they went up, the draw. No, you need to know what it looks like through that one person's eyes.
And that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for coming. Hopefully you learned something here. And I'll speak for everyone else here. If you've got any specific questions, I'm sure everybody will take a moment to try to answer that. Thank you very much.